From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to our Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Fun to be here on a holiday Wednesday, looking out these beautiful windows at the grill room. We see nothing but fog. Well, we can see Sausalito in the distance over there. So our speaker today was born in Florida in a hurricane. It was an amazing Cat 3 hurricane, and as he tells the story, his dad whisked his mother off to the hospital, and ever since then he's been a certified blowhard. His words, not mine. I wonder if I was born in a hurricane. At any rate, he went on to Florida State, got a degree in journalism and psychology. I guess you need both these days. And then went off to the right thing you should do right after you graduate from high school, which is tour America on a motorcycle. So 4,000 miles later, as he came into Big Sur and looked around, he said, yeah, this is it, end of the journey. I don't need to go anywhere else. I want to live in California. So he hung out in California for several years. From ages 22 to 26, he became an apprentice and a journeyman carpenter. And there's nothing like being a carpenter to teach you that you don't want to do manual work anymore. So he quit all that and went up to Mendocino and became a writer. And he started working as a journalist, which gives you the kind of research orientation you need to be a really, really great writer in this, in the view of some of us. And while he was up there, he spent time writing for the Chronicle and for New West magazine, and spent 22 years as the outdoor editor for the Chronicle. And you wonder who it is that they can get to write about Field and Stream, and he worked for National Fishermen, and well, we found it. He's our speaker today, so he knows more about writing for the outdoors than most folks. But he all the time had this fiction notion in his head. He wanted to write books. He's now written 10 and published 5. And this latest book, Splinter, which is what he's going to talk about today, is fun and has some connections to our San Francisco. Those of you who remember Lawrence Ferlinghetti, a great kind of incredibly cool guy in the San Francisco pantheon of characters. And in my opinion, the characters of the world are what give the environment around them character. And Lawrence left lots of great character tones everywhere he went. Well, he has a connection to this story, Splinter, that our speaker will talk about today. And those of us who remember, you know, I was born at the end of World War II, I guess during World War II, but we learned as we grew up about all these amazing European, war stories. My dad was in the Pacific, but all the stuff that happened in Norway and in Europe was pretty incredible. So we're going to hear about the amazing Norwegian defense to the overwhelming power of the Nazis as personified in his book Splinter. So it's fun to welcome to our stage. He also, by the way, has written for the Snob Hill Gazette. Those of you who remember that there is such a local publication, especially written for the denizens of the hill up here, many of whom have joined our yacht club as well. So we consider him a local writing treasure. Paul McHugh, welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
First of all, thanks, Ron. Thanks for the Yacht Club for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And one of the things that happens to peaceful nations and peaceful folks, sometimes they can be surprised. And so it's important to stay prepared. Or as the famous Bruce Lee once said, it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. So Adolf Hitler and Germany, Nazi Germany, made one huge mistake in June of 1941 when they tore up the Non-Aggression Pact and invaded Russia. But he made another large mistake a year earlier, which was right after Poland and Czechoslovakia, he decided to invade Denmark and Norway, which really pissed off the Vikings. And that's not really a good way to get yourself started. And it just goes to prove if it's a bad idea to put a megalomaniac and a maniac at the helm of your nation. So the Viking heritage of Norway, when you think about it, these are people for whom the Baltic the North Atlantic and the North Sea was their turf for centuries. And in the 20th century, the inheritors of this were Norway's fishermen, leading industry, and they had fishing boats like this one, the Andelman, which is an existing living history exhibit afloat near Stavanger. And this boat was launched in 1938. It participated in the Shetland's bus run, which was commando run and guerrilla run from Scalloway and the Shetland Islands to the fjords of Norway. And there were 21 boats that did 205 missions between Scotland and Norway during the first 3 years of the war. And the Andelman actually got in the action early, and it was one of the boats that ferried British soldiers ashore to fight in Narvik. When Germany invaded, they invaded all 6 major port areas of Norway simultaneously on the morning of April 9th, 1940. The Andelman survives as an example of that. It still has its original Wichmann one-cylinder diesel engine with a classic tonk-a-tonk exhaust that makes a great soundtrack for a movie. And it was a engine that was described as designed by geniuses for use by morons. So it was a very durable power source. In addition to that, it had 2 triangular sails mounted on the mast that were okay for a following wind or beam reach, but otherwise not adjustable, but improved the gas mileage. Anyway, as you can see, the Andelman was a model for the 2 boats in Splinter, the Snecka, and also the Ambo, which shows up later in the book. And I will give you a short reading, introducing my lead character in the first part of Splinter. And this is young Christian Thorson, 17-year-old fisherman's son, on the morning of April 9th. Ice crackled like thin glass as Christian stepped onto the deck of the Snecka. He glanced down, saw a maze of fault lines radiate from the soles of his boots. The previous night, a sleety thunderstorm had raged, chased by a frost that had glazed white every plank, spar, and rope on Ragnar's fishing smack. Christian's father had named his boat Snecka to honor Norse workboats of old, Snekker, while also making a joke. In Icelandic, Snecka now meant yacht. So besides the fishing boats, and this was one of the most amazing parts of the Viking heritage and the seagoing heritage of Norway, 85% of Norway's commercial fleet was escaped the grip of Nazi Germany. Only 50% was captured. And that number of cargo boats, 1,100 of them, became the backbone of many a convoy sent to support both Britain and Russia over the course of the war. There were 30,000 Norwegian commercial sailors that participated in the war. And you may wonder why they were so committed about getting their boats out of Norway. And that is because German U-boats began sinking them before Norway was even invaded. And they had lost, they had already lost 58 ships and 400 men before April of 1940. So those ships went under the control of the Norwegian government in exile and became their main source of funding for the course of the war. And by the end of the war, 3,700 Norwegian sailors had lost their lives. So the Oppo force included ships like the Blucher, which was renamed the Merlik in my novel Splinter. And the Blucher did not survive even a year after launch. And the reason was it met determined opposition in the Oslo Fjord on the morning of the invasion. The Blucher was 667 feet long, length overall. It was about 2/3 the size of the Bismarck, but it didn't get to survive as long as the Bismarck, so it didn't achieve quite as much fame. Carl Nolte asked me about her armaments. She had 8 8-inch guns and 12 4-inch guns, and carried 3 Arado seaplanes, and it also had other capabilities, including torpedo tubes. But this is the Tirpitz, so it was about 2/3 of that size. When, in the wee hours of the morning on April 9th, it sailed into Oslo Fjord. There is a fortress called the Oscarsborg right in halfway up the fjord, and it had its own armaments, including these 11-inch guns nicknamed Moses and Aaron, and well-practiced but skeleton crews of gunmen that were able to fire just 2 shells at the Blücher. But one thing that went in German intelligence failure was that just past the fort was a land-based torpedo battery the Germans knew nothing about. And after the 2 shells from the fort hit, 2 torpedoes hit. And this is the view down one of those gun barrels towards the fjord, which you'd be seeing as the Blücher sailed in. And this is what the Blücher got to look like a few hours later. So on that morning, there had to be some considerable surprise on the part of denizens. And this is another scene. In Splinter, I renamed the Blücher the Merlicht because the Blücher was attacked at 2:30 in the morning and began to sink at 4:30 and finally turned turtle, as you see here, at dawn. But I wanted my main characters to be able to see the action instead of just muzzle flashes. So I moved up the sinking of the Blücher to sunrise and renamed it the Merlicht, which in German means more light. From a bank of cold mist, a gray shape with a scarlet pennant on its bow rammed into sight. It was a German battle cruiser with no good reason to be so far up on a Norwegian fjord. A red flag emblazoned with a black swastika was followed into dawn light by giant turrets of long-barreled guns. Christian gaped at it, astonished. "She's the Merlicht," Otto exclaimed, "pride of Herr Hitler's Kriegsmarine. A task force Germany sent to Norway to guarantee our neutrality. Isn't she splendid?" Christian's mind raced. Protect our neutrality by invading us? That doesn't make a lick of sense. And it didn't. So, you had the Snecka, this gentleman is standing in for it now, taking on board wounded Norwegian officers and trying to help them escape, and then sailing, trying to get back to its home port of Stavanger, and then deciding that it's going to try to take them over to Britain so they can join the British Armed Forces and fight back, with the unfortunate result that the Snecka is sunk, and Christian is the only survivor. Now, one of the things that all good boats have is a lifeboat, and in my description, I have Christian trying to get off the Snecka onto his lifeboat and try to row to Scotland. And you may think, well, how unlikely is that? So unlikely that it didn't often succeed, but it did sometimes. This is a rowboat that Norwegian fishermen used to actually row from Norway to Scotland. And it's in a museum in Televåg as part of the North Sea traffic. There are 2 successful rowboat crossings that we know about. How did I get interested in this story? How did I pursue it? Well, in 2006, I was still working for the San Francisco Chronicle, and I had heard that Lawrence Ferlinghetti, famous poet, famous peacenik, had been a sailor in World War II, and I had never read anything about that. And I thought, well, that might make a good Veterans Day Enterprise story. What did you do in the war, Daddy? So I called up the City Lights bookstore, and to my surprise and delight, Ferlinghetti agreed to be interviewed. So we went to his favorite North Beach hangout, Café Trieste, and we talked for 3 hours about his wartime experiences. And there is plenty in that story and in that interview that you can find out. You can research it on the Chronicle's website. And also I have a link to it, I think, on my own website. But what happened was, the thing that really captivated me was he was in Miami, Florida, waiting for 3 subchasers to be delivered in cradles on the deck of the Liberty ship. When it arrived, and he was supposed to offload the subchasers and take them to patrol off the Florida Keys. But the skipper of the Liberty ship said, "I'm sorry." He said, that's not happening. Instead of the boats getting off, you're getting on. You're going on a secret mission and you can't tell anybody about it. So here you go. And then he found out his secret mission was going to Scotland, transferring the 3 subchasers to the Norwegian resistance so they could be used for the Shetland bus run. And because here was the problem. Those fishing boats had a max speed of 6 knots. And as the Germans began to get clued in on how the commando run was operating, how the shuttle was working, they began to sink those boats and to look out for them. In fact, a law was passed that if you left Norway without permission on a boat, you could be subject to the death penalty. So it was decided that the Norwegian resistance needed boats that could go faster and that could shoot back, and that was the subchasers. The subchasers were nicknamed the Splinter fleet because they were made of wood, 3-inch thick pine planking, 110 feet long, and they were capable of cruising at 12 knots and flank speed of 20 knots when pressed. And that was, there were 438 of them built during wartime, and they were indeed armed. Their key arm was a Bofors 40mm automatic cannon, and they had Colt 50 caliber water-cooled machine guns. And to fight subs, they could also throw depth charges. Interestingly, only one documented submarine kill was attributed to the U.S. subchasers, but they became really key in other operations. They did close-in shore support for amphibious landings. They were sent out after downed Allied pilots floating around in life rafts to see if they could find them. And the ones that were used in Norway were key, and they stopped using fishing boats in 1943 and relied just on the 3 subchasers. And the 3 subchasers not only were never sunk, they were never even attacked. And the one in this photograph is called the Hitra, and it is a fully restored historic exhibit in the Harbor Håkonsvern base in Bergen. And it is one of the 3 subchasers that Frøling had brought to Norway. And when I went there in 2018, I photographed her from stem to stern. And then I created a photo book with 100 photographs of the Hitra and gave it to Frøling on his 100th birthday.
Oh my God.
So I'm pretty happy about that. And one other thing that I will say about the subchasers is there's another famous subchaser commander who was cashiered for a bunch of problematic behaviors. And his name, he was the skipper of the SE-815, and his name was L. Ron Hubbard. Yes. But this would be a photograph of a Norwegian resistance newspaper announcing the arrival of the subchasers. That's not the only small boat involved in the war, or the only small boat involved in my novel Splinter. So they decided that they would, the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, decided that they needed a commando craft. And early in the 20th century, small folding kayaks had been invented in Germany, but there was an Englishman named Hon who had invented something called the fall boat that was being produced in Australia. So that was the domestic product. And for the commando operations, they were codenamed cockles because of the cockle shells. And this would be an MK2 holding 2 men. And in Splinter, we have an MK1 holding 1, which is a full boat. And it's a hickory frame with hinges and a rubberized canvas shell. And in Splinter, we have Christian Thorsen, who becomes a commando for the resistance, launching from the diving plane of a mine-laying submarine and doing a mission where he's taking a radio wireless transmitter into a double agent working for Britain in Stavanger. And so I ran across this historic photo of a commando boat being launched from a submarine. And this is an example of how I tried to apply real historic research to the fictional exploits of my hero. Everything that I wanted to do in Norway was what I call ground proofing, which is to talk to people who knew the era, to go to historic museums and sites, to get a feel for the terrain, and be able to visualize vividly the events and the characters who participated in them, and what it would have taken for them to accomplish their exploits. What you're looking at in this photograph is an anchor of the Blucher, which is brought up from 300 feet down, where the battleship still rests at the bottom of Oslo Fjord. And it's in a park on the waterfront in Drøbak. And in the background, what you see is the island where the Austersborg Fort is. And I like to go there. I like to be on site. Here I am sitting on the anchor, so I could prove I was there. And I began writing this book in 2018, as I said, and when Ukraine was invaded in 22, I was struck by the parallels between the way that Hitler invaded Norway and the way Putin invaded Ukraine, very similar. And I realized that the moral lesson that comes across in Splinter, and I hope endures, is that you have ordinary people in extraordinary times that have to rise to the challenge. And I have one character who's also a spy in Stavanger, who's working for the Allies, nicknamed Herman the German. And he says to Christian at one point, "Let fascism establish itself, and look at the ridiculous measures one must take to try to uproot it." And I hope that's the main takeaway from Splinter, as well as a darn good story. So thank you for your attention, and I wish you all fair winds and following seas of the year.
So you started in journalism and you ended up writing some novels, and this is a fact-based novel.
Yeah.
How many of the facts are based on reality?
A jillion.
A jillion. So talk about the difference between writing journalism and then writing essentially a novel, which is a fictional account based upon real evidence. What are the reasons why you make it a novel rather than a totally fact-based endeavor?
Okay, so one of my favorite quotes of art is Picasso's, and he said, everybody knows that art is a lie. Art is not the truth, but it is a lie that helps us realize. So there are in real life and in real history already devices like compression and elision that occur. So reality itself is far too complex to render simply, even in a book that intends to be 100% factual. So how do you get around that? How do you present the truth if it's very hard to contain? And I think one way is you ground it in the facts that are relevant to your story, and then in the characters that you present, you get a certain freedom to imagine things as they might have been, and to compress history and to invigorate it in ways that we don't factually know, but which very well could have happened. And so that was my aim, is to ground it in fact and illuminate it with fiction.
So now you've written 10 books, published 5, so you've got a process. Talk a little bit about the process for this book. When did the germ of the idea start? And then give us a kind of a 10 high points from there to here.
Okay, so it started with the Ferlinghetti episode and learning about his transfer of the subchasers to the resistance. After that, I thought, okay, if I'm going to go to Norway and research this, I can't go in cold. I can't, I've got to spend my time wisely. So I got a invitation, or wangled an invitation to visit the Norwegian Consul General in San Francisco. He wanted to meet me, Joe Sledback. I went there. He assigned a staffer named Three Stauer to help me. And she provided me with the names of Norwegian writers, historians, historic sites, and even the former chief of Norway's Navy. And so with those contacts, I was able to plan a trip, and in 2 weeks, went everywhere I possibly could. And then, of course, added to that with a lot of book reading, actual histories, watching movies from the era. And it was a combination of finding those nuggets of historical fact and then fantasizing about what it meant that made me possible to do a draft, and then do a subsequent draft, and then another draft. And so it's a little bit like a sculpture, the idea of like having the angel emerge from the marble.
Mm-hmm.
So the first draft, you just get it down, and then as you chip away and as you polish, then the finished story begins to manifest.
Are you using an outline in that first draft, or how do you do it?
I have an outline, but it's a vague outline, and it's a very nautical metaphor that I use sometimes, because I grew up in Florida and I was very familiar with the Intercoastal Waterway. It's like you set out from port, and then there's a few pilings, and then there's in the distance there's another piling, and way off there's a buoy, and then maybe out on a reef there's a lighthouse. Okay, it doesn't tell you every point you need to hit on the way out to sea, but it gives you enough reference points. And so that's where the nuggets play a role. It's like, I know this is a really cool event I want to talk about. I know that's a really cool person I want to make reference to. I kind of know how this ends, right? But in between, you got a lot of maneuver. So I don't do a strict outline. I just do kind of that general one with the most attractive points in it.
And so when you start writing, is it a time in the morning when you always discipline yourself to get up and do it? How do you handle that sort of prioritizing your own time?
There are people that write that way, but that's not my method. My method is I think about it all the time, whether I'm in the shower or no matter what I'm doing, right? But then I write whenever I understand what's next. And I generally like to write for an hour, then do a little exercise, so I don't lose my health.
Mm-hmm.
Then I go back, write for another hour, another couple hours. But every once in a while, when it's going well, when it really takes hold, I kind of get into what I call the writer's trance. And that's when the pages really spill out. And I might write for a whole day straight.
Now, you went to Norway, you spent some time on the fjord, on the Oslo fjord. Yeah, I've sailed on the Oslo fjord, and it is really a dramatic thing. Those who haven't been there, it's basically created by glaciers a long time ago. And it's this long, skinny, deeply V-shaped geographic feature, which is quite dramatic. And the Norwegians make fun of their brawny, healthy lifestyle for a good reason. It is healthy. They live a long time, and they like to jump off cliffs and see what happens on the way down.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about Scandinavia is not everybody doesn't have a cabin in the woods, but everybody is supposed to have a cabin in the woods. And if you don't have one, then you make sure you have a friend who has one. And so this was another of the big assets during World War II, is because the Norwegians were ski mountaineers. They knew where their huts were, and a lot of the resistance fighters would go hide in those huts during the wintertime. And it was those people that working as commandos for the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, that mounted the winter raid on the heavy water plant at Telemark, which is another great story of Norwegian resistance. Mm-hmm. They actually did a big thing to prevent Germany from getting an iron bomb.
So it's also amazing, the fjord, a history of fast boats. The Norwegians basically, the Vikings would basically pull into an area, quickly attack it, and the faster their boat was, the more surprise they had getting in, and the better they were escaping when they ran out. So they were real good at those longboats. I rode, like a replica of a 1,000-year-old longboat when I was in Norway one time racing the World Championships. It was remarkable how fast you could get those things going, literally with just oars. So when I saw your picture of these super narrow, fast boats that they used around the fjord, 20 knots is the real number. I saw boats that were skinny like that from World War II that could go 20 knots. And in those days, that was all of a mail.
Yeah, it was.
Inspiring.
And there was one funny thing about the subchasers, though, that could hit 20. They had a sharp bow, but they had a kind of a round hull and narrow beam. So they were seasickness machines. They were very rolling, and so even old salts that were just flying on a battleship could turn green on a subchaser.
Wow. So now I'm going to keep asking questions, but we have some great guests here to help us with questions. First off, I have to introduce Staff Commodore and First Questionnaire Bruce Monroe. Wave at us, Bruce. Bruce is a really good sailor, good buddy. And of course, you did work and mention the Chronicle, and we do have amongst us a 60-year veteran of the Chronicle, our own really infamous, more than famous, Carl Nolte. Carl, and his sweetheart, Darlene Plumtree. She's the CEO of our Maritime Museum, on whose board I'm proud to serve. But also, just to make sure I stay on the good side of the world, I want to introduce my adorable fiancée, Christine, who's also here. And we have out-of-town holiday guests, her sister Cynthia, and her brother-in-law, my soon-to-be brother-in-law, Ken. So Cynthia and Ken, welcome to San Francisco. And we have to say a smile to, I'm the chairman of the WYL Yachting Luncheon for all these years, having started in '91, but 20 or so years ago, we added the vice chairman, Kathy Trafton. Welcome, Kathy, to be to our listening people. And lastly, somebody who actually read your book. Sailors can read, some of us. And Bruce Stone actually read your book. He's a renowned sailor. Bruce, welcome. You can attest it's a good book, Bruce? A real good book. So as I ask questions, if you have one, raise your hand, and we'll. We have one already. Right. I'm surprised as heck. Bruce Monroe's going to ask a question. Commodore, sir.
So, I have to say, about 8 years ago, I had an extended hospitalization, and a friend gave me a book I never heard of, but it was a wonderful book. It was called The Shetland Bus, and it was written by the British naval officer who started up the base in the Shetland Islands that was the home base for the Norwegian fishermen who brought their boats to the Shetland Island and ran back and forth between the Shetlands and Norway. And that's how they got the name, the Shetland Bus. And I'm just wondering, how much does your book rely on the story of the Shetland Bus? Wonderful story.
Quite a bit, and that is one of the books I read for my research. There's a Norwegian film that stars the most famous Shetland Bus commander and one of the most decorated naval officers of the war, Leif Shetland Larsen. And so if you have a chance to get that film and watch it you can't get it with subtitles, you'll see the actual guy on an actual boat doing the actual things that occurred in the Shetland Bus. Side point on Leif Shetland Larsen led a attack on the Tirpitz, which was moored in the headwaters of one of the fjords. One of the most dramatic and daring commando exploits of the whole war.
Yes, I remember that part of the book. Unfortunately, that incident did not end well. They did not sink the Tirpitz, but the crew escaped over the mountains to Sweden. The crew did escape, but their method of having the torpedo underneath one of those fishing boats did not work.
No.
But it was a good try.
It was a damn good try.
So you mentioned what percent of the Norwegian fishing craft escaped. Talk to me about that number.
Well, it wasn't the number I had was for the commercial vessels.
Okay.
And that was 85%.
85% escaped, you said.
Yeah. Now the number of vessels in the Shetland Bus, fishing boats, was 21.
Okay.
And the number of missions that they did in 3 years was 205.
And then you mentioned the percentage of ships of those such boats that were captured.
Oh, I don't have that percentage. I
Okay.
mean, you never knew when a boat was lost, whether the Germans had sunk it or whether it had been lost in storms. Because, even though they're very seaworthy, you're still crossing the North Sea.
Right.
So almost anything can happen.
I've been owned by a Norwegian 1937 IOD for about 32 years. And in its custody, I recognize that the Norwegians really do know how to build a boat that would be fast and last a long time.
Yeah.
They really, in the whole world, they've made a craft of it. Of course, the Viking heritage means that's how they started their game. So these little boats that got smaller and smaller that are in your story, talk to us about those.
The fishing boats or the kayaks?
Both.
Okay. So the
Kayaks is a crazy idea.
it is a crazy idea.
Yeah.
So
Only Norwegians would consider this feasible.
So the fishing boats, the Angelman, which is the one in my photographs, made a voyage back in 2003 and ran into a gale on the North Sea. And she was commanded at that point by a Norwegian ex-submarine commander who was hoping that it would submerge one last time. But he and his sailors were astounded at how well the boat handled in the storm. He said it actually rode easily and well and danced over these waves, far more than he ever imagined it could. Now the smallest boats, the Clevers, so I'm a highly experienced kayaker. I began kayaking in '76, and I did sea kayak racing on the bay. And my biggest story for the Chronicle was a 400-mile sea kayak voyage from the Oregon border to San Francisco Bay in '05.
And you did that?
Yeah.
You didn't just write about this.
I didn't imagine that one. I'm very familiar with how kayaks handle and what they're good at and what they're not so good at. Okay. Probably the first surf vessels in the world were Inuit kayaks with wood frames and bone parts and sealskin or walrus-skin coverings. And there is one at Fort Ross up on the coast. And looking at it with a view to the hydraulics, you can see that there's got really good control surfaces. That's one thing. The other thing is that a boat like that is flexible. And so we're used to thinking of stiffness as a value. But flexibility allows the boat to slither in situations where another boat might be buffeted. And so even though it may look like a primitive craft, there's a lot of things it can handle. The full boats that were first used when our young hero used them in 1940 were actually, they had been in service for 20 years by then. And all the SOE did was put camouflage paint on. Christian Thorson, 17 years old, is a fisherman's son. He understands the shore, he understands the currents, tides, winds, and he's young and fit. He can handle himself pretty well. So his first part of his mission, which is bringing a wireless radio into Splinter, goes well. The next part, towards the end of the book, he has to bring secrets about the Luftwaffe bombing to the Allies, and he has to rendezvous with the submarine or some other Allied craft again, and he paddles out in the teeth of a gale. And so that's some of the real exciting stuff.
How far were his trips in this?
They would have been about 20 kilometers.
20 kilometers.
Yeah.
So what's 20 kilometers? That's like 16 miles or something like that?
Yeah.
So would they have an enclosed
Yes.
in the cockpit?
It's called a spray deck.
Spray deck on the boat?
So it cinches around your waist and cinches around the cockpit. And then if you're really interested in survival, then you either have float bags or you have which are airbags essentially, or some other kind of non-compressible light stuff inside your boat. So there are procedures of, if you capsize, of rolling up, which is difficult to do in a full boat, or remounting and pumping it out.
When you came down the coast, what was the distance you paddled and how long did you do it in?
Well, that was, the funny thing about that was I picked September as the month to do it because all the commercial fishermen I talked to said, this is fixed. You know, the days aren't the longest, but the weather's the calmest, the seas are the calmest, you can make your best progress. So I had scheduled 400 miles, 40 days, 10 miles a day, easy peasy. What happened was that September in 2005, we were hit by 3 gales over the course of the trip.
You felt at home.
So that was, became hole up and sprint, hole up and sprint, So we were losing like 3 days at a time waiting for the weather to calm down. I was me and 2 other paddlers.
You were able to persuade these other people to do such a crazy thing.
That's right. They were they were kayak instructors and people that I had raced with, so we knew each other pretty well. We knew we didn't have to worry about each other too much. Yeah.
In your story, what size are the kayaks?
They're about the size of maybe The full boat would be like 15 or 16 feet long.
And the one that you came down the coast in, what size?
That was 18 feet long. And
How much
it was a
weight?
German kayak. It was heavier. It was made out of high impact plastic, Prion, and it's called a Prion Kodiak, and built for expeditions. And we knew that the boats might have to take a beating, and they did. Probably the hardest thing we did was a landing on the Klamath River bar in 10-foot surf.
So now, I've been in kayaks and I learned how to roll them, you know, to go around like that, which is really a cool safety feature.
It is.
And once you learn how to do it, it's like capsizing a dinghy. You'll learn how to get back up. And, you know, the safest thing you can do is right away learn how to get yourself right side up, because that's a safety feature. So how often coming down the coast did that ever happen? Because I know the experienced guys say it won't happen to you once you know how to do it.
Well, actually, I never capsized.
Yeah.
You know, except the Klamath River bar, that was a crash landing. I didn't intend for it to be, but what happened was, surf landings, you have to really study the swell. Right? And then you figure out which one you're going to take in and which ones you want to avoid. Right. So I picked a pretty good lull, but I didn't realize how steep the Klamath River beach, that bar is. Right. So I was able to sail on in and got my bow on the sand, and I'm thinking, okay, good, now I'm going to get out. But what happened instead was the undertow sucked me right back out.
Yes, imagine.
And then I thought, here comes the next wave. What I'm going to do is I'm going to brace into it, and I'll swash up on the beach sideways. Instead, what happened was I got window shaded, rolled upside down. My paddle snapped in half, so I couldn't roll up. So then I bailed out, and then this is like the ultimate safety procedure. Instead, in order to retain connection to your boat, you grab the cockpit rim and you wrap your body around the center of the kayak. Then now you're traveling together. You and the next wave that hit washed us both up the beach. Kayak's full of water. Dig my knees into the sand. Dig the cockpit rim to the sand. The wave recedes, so I'm still there.
What an adventure! So these guys who were doing this in World War II, they were going how many miles, and talk about the dangers?
Well, they're easy to hold. You know, it's a fabric cover. So, I mean, it wouldn't just be a bullet. You know, you bump a rock or rub against a barnacle covered piling, you know, and
you're sinking.
You're sinking. You've got to be, keep yourself watertight, keep your head. You've got to be good at navigation. Most of this is taking place at night. So, compass skills, key. Dead reckoning, key. And
those who don't recognize the term dead reckoning, when I started sailing before GPS and all those things, that's how we did everything. It was all dead reckoning. We'd say, okay, we're going to set a compass course of 210, and we're going to go for an hour and 15 minutes, and that means we should be at 4 knots at this place in the location. And the longer you dead reckon, the more easy it is for you to be way the hell off of where you think you are, because this estimate compounds with that estimate, and if you're off a little bit. So dead reckoners get to be pretty smart about what's going on after they keep doing it.
So the use of the kayaks by the British military continued to accelerate through the war. They're used for very dramatic missions. So they wound up with a 4-man kayak made out of folding aluminum panels.
Wow.
And there were raids in France and elsewhere that were highly successful, especially on things like coastal radar sites of the Germans, because they wanted to wipe those out or impair them so that the Allied bombing runs would be more successful.
So what was your cruising speed coming down the hill from Oregon?
You mean what?
What's your average
with
speed?
A fully loaded boat?
Yeah.
It really depended on whether you were riding with the current or against it, or with the wind or against it. But we rarely would exceed 4 knots. Sometimes you could if you got a boost. And if you were fighting against a northerly current, which there is off the Atoll, then you're down to like 2 knots of paddling hard.
Of net speed. And the Norwegian, the sort of like courageous Norwegian kayakers, how long could they survive? Did they bring much food with them, and did they fish? How they feed themselves in
Well,
the
you
water?
wouldn't do a long mission.
Uh-huh.
No, the whole point.
These are like 2-3 day deals? How long would they be?
Well, you would tend to be launched from some kind of a support vessel.
Okay.
Like a British torpedo boat.
Okay.
Or a submarine.
Uh-huh.
And then, you want to attain your objective within 24 hours.
Mhm.
The whole idea was not to be out there exposed because the Germans were flying coastal patrols, and they were used to stopping vessels. They probably weren't used to seeing or stopping kayaks, but they wanted to keep it that way.
So now, I have another question over here. Aha, Diego Mendoza has a question. Diego. By the way, we should congratulate Diego. He's been made CTO of his company, a $2 billion company. Congratulations, Diego.
So you mentioned Writer's Trance. I'm familiar, and it's where I've done some of my best work. So naturally, I'm curious, did going to Norway fuel your Writer's Trance? And if so, can you recall a particular moment in Norway?
When you are visualizing a scene, it's a lot like the process of starting a dream when you're asleep. And then the scene becomes more and more vivid. And I don't know if I'm unique in this respect, but I have the ability to make my external surroundings disappear depending on how intensely I'm imagining something. And it could be an old memory from my own life or an event. But certainly in writing, what happens is the movie I'm showing myself and my frontal lobes becomes so detailed and so impressive, and I want to capture it. I feel like Samuel Taylor Coleridge under the use of opium writing Kubla Khan. What's the interesting element of it is when I finally come to, as it were, I'm aware that my body is stiff and my butt is flat and I really need to go for a walk. And I realized 3 or 4 hours have gone by. And I've whipped through a lot of pages. I'm not saying that what I've written at that point is good, because all writing is rewriting, really. It's like you've got to polish. If you think you're going to do a great first draft of anything, you're destined to stay amateur status. But what is gotten down is the bones of that scene and the bones of the interaction. And I've heard the characters' voices. I've heard the characters tell me, no, I wouldn't do that. I'd do this. I've heard them say, I would say this, but not to her. That sort of internal logic of the storytelling becomes manifest during the trance.
So do you keep a notepad, a little book that you make notes about all the time? How often in a day do you enter something into your notebook?
Well, I will do it in the notebook a couple times a day, and I'll do it on envelopes at the dining room table and the margins of newspapers almost continuously.
So tell me a scared moment in writing this book. Were there any fearful moments? Did you get scared by anything?
That I'm writing about?
Yeah, or in writing the process. When did you personally was there ever a moment when you were afraid?
Okay, I can tell you 2 things, okay? The end scene of Splinter, when Christian has to ride his kayak through a storm to reach the rendezvous point. Mm-hmm. I based on a storm I went through in a kayak off of some islands off the coast of southern Chile called Las Islas Peligrosas. And the storm was a storm that the locals call El Blanco, and it comes up from Antarctica. And in a matter of 30 minutes, it went from decent weather to 40 knot gale with 20-foot breaking seas heading our way. And the goal, the little fishing town where you had to meet a tramp steamer, was completely socked in and invisible. So that was a moment of terror that had to be managed for survival. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the scene I gave Christian at the end of the
So you drew upon that to write that part of the book.
That's right.
So talk about...
Let me tell you one more. So it's true.
Yeah.
Okay. So on my last research trip, I went to the former Gestapo headquarters in Baltic. and it's still, and part of it's intact. The torture rooms, the cells, the implements, and
The tools of the torture, you mean? Like,
yeah, where the Gestapo actually tortured Norwegians.
Mhm.
And on the sidewalk outside, that's on the 5th floor, there's 3 bronze plaques dedicated to the resistance fighters who jumped through the windows to escape the torture and not give up their compatriots.
Uh-huh.
That scared me.
Give us a moment which was really fun in writing this book.
Well, actually, in a twisted way, all of the way. But I would say the first time I went to what's called the Homefront Museum in Oslo, which is the main resistance museum, I was met by the acting director, Frodo Freud, and he took me upstairs into their stacks, and he brought me a cup of coffee, and he sat down, and he listened to everything I wanted to do, and he made resources available to me, and it was just like I was embraced with open arms, because I wanted to learn about their history, and I wanted to like dig into it, and he knew it, and he appreciated it, and he welcomed me, and he helped me. That was wonderful.
So, Hitler, this autocrat who's democratically elected to Germany, invades Norway on all kinds of false pretenses, and here we are in America, 2023. Talk to us about that, how it felt to be writing this book with the timely parallels that are evident everywhere.
It's not well understood, I think, how much there was a fascist presence in the U.S. at the start of World War II. There was a rally for the American Bund at Madison Square Garden with 30,000 attendees. All
Supporters of the movement.
They were Nazis themselves, okay, American Nazis. So we've had that element before. It's always kind of worked. During World War II, it became unfashionable. After World War II, it remained unfashionable for a long period. But there's 2 things that we need to be wary of, and that is the search for simple solutions, simplistic solutions might be a better way to put it, and also the siren call of atavism, that trying to make primitive emotions righteous, grievance, anger, separation from the other. I'm a mix myself, politically and emotionally, liberal and conservative. And I think this is something that sailors understand intuitively. You need free movement, that's wind and sails. You need resistance, that's the keel and rudder, right? Put them together, you've got forward movement. So we need people that want change, and we need people to say, hold on there, wait a minute, let's analyze this, okay? But it's when you start to nurture the extremes that you get into trouble. You need a middle where there's negotiable ground. Then you can resist fascism. Once you get extremes, then you have to realize that combating the fascist appeal means realizing how dangerous it is, realizing how subversive it is, realizing how difficult it is to get people that have been coaxed and spellbound by lies to see anything else. So that's the work in front of us.
So with such a timely book behind you, what do you do for a follow-up act?
The sequel to Splinter is Splinter 2. And I'm already 13 chapters in.
Good for you. When would we expect it?
Well, I am hoping to have the first draft done in spring. And I'm going back to Norway for more research. So.
Wonderful. Paul McHugh, author of Splinter. Very great to have you as Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.